And then so we've had a little shift up in the design of today's conversation. There are actually going to be 2 other folks joining, but due to weather constraints, they're not able to come. So I just wanted to turn it over to Davis, who was originally going to moderate the conversation, who's kindly now stepped in, shifted her role to actually just share a little bit about the folks who couldn't make it.
Happy to do that. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Davis Erin Anderson. I work for a nonprofit called Metro Library Council. We provide essential services, I would think, to libraries, archives, and museums in New York City and Westchester County. And on this panel today, my boss was going to be moderating. I gave him that role so that I could sit here. But then he told me that there's trees felled in Westchester, and it's very crazy. So I was like, okay, I'll moderate. And then our second panelist, Nick Higgins, who's interim chief librarian at Brooklyn Public Library, also comes from Westchester and has the same issues. So that crazy storm last night was annoying for me, but devastating for them. So I wish them all the best. And we'll be thinking about them as I answer the questions today.
So just very quickly, I want to say you are all now here for Libraries, your partner in safeguarding privacy. And Jeff, will you introduce yourself? And then I'm going to turn some questions over to the room.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here and for sticking around today. My name is Jeff Lambert. I work at Queens Library as the Digital Literacy Coordinator. This is a new position that our system created this past May, and I work with digital inclusion fairly broadly, but specifically how that translates is access and adoption in our community libraries. So we have 62 community libraries throughout the borough of Queens, and I work with our technology educators at those locations. So free and open classes on basic to advanced technology.
Thank you. Sorry, it's like end of the day. We're all slowing down a little bit. I realized I forgot to tell you who I am. My name is Meghan McDermott with the Mozilla Foundation. Thank you for coming. What we wanted to do, actually, we just checked in as a group before moving into a more formal Q&A, is to actually ask you all to turn to someone next to you and share your first memory of when you walked into a library. What was it like? And then also share your most recent experience walking into a library. Why did you go? Okay, so we're just going to give you a minute. Turn to your partner. You can be in groups of 3 if you need to. Okay, why don't we come back? Are folks ready? It's late in the day. All right, folks in the back, we're going to come back together. Thank you for taking time to share your thoughts with each other. Anyone have a specific story or highlight that you might want to share back to the full group? A memory, a reason that brought you to the library? Sorry, I didn't mean to shut you all down. I just wanted to hear, but just from your shares, was there a particular memory, something that you wanted to share back?
Thank you. Oh, okay. So I was saying the last time I went was at the Jamaica Library in Queens, and I was it was a class project the group of us were meeting to work on, and I was saying I was like that library because it's a very inclusive space and it feels very much like a community center, and that's sort of like it's sometimes a little bit loud for me, but I like philosophically I appreciate the fact that it's a space that's like there for people in the community and that there is like just so much activity. On hold. Sorry.
And Natarajan had gone to an event at a library, and that struck me as a slightly different sort of purpose for a library as a community space and as a different information point that it's sharing. It was a talk sharing information, but it was a very different way of communicating that information.
Actually, it occurred to me that my most recent use of the library system was using the online catalog to look for something. Physically, I went to the Science and Business Library recently in Manhattan to use the Wi-Fi, and an early memory was long before computers, we filled out paper slips to take out books, and there was blue ink that was stamped on. It was just so, it was so cool. But
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, we'll take one more and then we're going to dive into our conversation.
Yeah. So I'm involved with the Wikimedia in New York City, so we support Wikipedia. And last weekend, we were at the Shadoworg Center in Harlem doing a training for people in the community. So I mean, it was I don't know, it's a place rich in history, and it was cool to meet people in the community who I don't know, were learning more and could share more about the community.
Yeah, thank you. So what's already beautiful about what you've shared, and I really thank you for doing that, is that these are places we go to, we see community, we share information, but also that these places, they draw us. Right? Libraries that surprise us, maybe we find things, we have deep memories for them. So just thank you for sharing that, because I think it's a good reminder for folks maybe who haven't spent time in libraries recently about the potential power that they have for our work. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Davis, who's going to tell us about the current data privacy project.
Thank you, Megan. So I'd like to tell you one of the projects I'm working on now. It's called NYC Digital Safety, Privacy and Security, hoping that NYC Digital Safety is a larger umbrella and that the work that we're doing with the 3 library systems can grow and expand into the future and cover lots of different topics about our online life these days. So the current project has its origins in a project that was funded by our federal funding agency for libraries, archives, and museums called IMLS. IMLS, we along with Brooklyn Public, New America, and Data and Society put together a grant that was accepted for the 2016 fiscal year that was meant to work with librarians to build privacy curriculum. So we were there to sort of help get the word out. We were hosts for 20 trainings in 2016 during the summer. And so we were fortunate to have Sita, whose name I can't pronounce, I'm very sorry about that, who works at New America and who had come through an NYC agency. So she knew folks at OTI. And so they caught wind of the work that we were doing, and they thought, wouldn't it be great if we scaled it to all 3 of the systems? And so they stepped in to provide funding to help us expand the curriculum so that frontline librarians across New York City have this training. So our work now is to scale it. It was basically an in-person 6-hour training in 2 different parts. And now we're looking at, can we make it replicable to many? And so we're producing an online version of it, which means that we're taking a look at the curriculum, unpacking it a little bit. We have an advisory council with lots of different stakeholders, and we have a curriculum committee who helped me sort of tear through it and figure out what's essential, what do we need to have on an online platform that learners can come, and no matter where they are in their history at the library, maybe it'll help onboard new librarian staff. And so we went through. We're now in the process. We've hired a group called Tandem to do the instruction design for it. So we're sort of negotiating with them, and we'll be doing a pilot test in a couple of months. So that'll sort of help us figure out if this is what librarians need. Can we add things to it? What works? What doesn't? And then we'll also be piloting and follow-on training that's in person that's meant to enhance the learning that was done online. So it's a really, I described it briefly, but it's kind of sizable. We've been at it since July, so I'm hoping to release this all into the hands of the library staff on May 15th this year, and so they'll have time to sort of get their minds engaged in this stuff, and then be available for New York City residents who have questions about privacy and security can come to libraries, and that's just another resource that we'll be able to provide at like full speed. That's sort of universal to the three systems. So the theory is you can walk into any library in New York City and someone there will be able to answer your questions.
Davis, can you just, for folks who may not be familiar, can you explain? For folks who may not be familiar, can you explain the relationship between the three systems?
Absolutely. It's a common question. I'm glad you asked it. So when I first got here, I moved to Queens, and my misconception was that New York Public Library was the entire, that was the system that everyone used, that you go to New York and you are a constituent of New York Public Library, full stop. Couldn't have been more wrong about that. I was in Woodside, and we had a very lovely branch library, the Woodside Branch Library, that was a part of Queens. And so I learned firsthand that first week when I didn't have a computer at home, when I was updating MySpace, this was back in the day, I would go to that library and like sit with all the teens who were updating their MySpace profiles too, which is really goofy, but that's like what I was into and how I was telling everyone about my New York journey. And I lived in like off Broadway in Queens, and I like wrote a post. I was like, I live off Broadway, and everyone's like, ooh, and then little did they know. So that's sort of my firsthand experience. I was like, oh, this is a totally separate system. They have a different logo. It's not NYPL. And then I sort of over time started to learn that Brooklyn Public is its own, Queens Library is its own, and then Staten Island, Manhattan, and the Bronx are all part of the New York Public Library. All told, Jeff mentioned that there are 62 branches of the Queens Library system. There are 214 for the city, including all three systems.
Thank you. So do folks have any clarifying questions for Davis before we hear from Jeff? Yes?
So these trainings,
Please.
just to clarify, are these trainings, you're training librarians, but you're training them to increase tech literacy with the public, or is this training them on library systems and like security of management of that stuff?
Sort of both. So we're training them to be able to answer questions to the public. We're giving them the tools they need to do programs. So our end users, in this case, are the library staff. So that we're increasing their capacity and their understanding of these issues for their own sake and for the patrons. So we're grounding it, we're rooting it in what our patrons experiencing, or users or customers. All three systems have different words that they use, which I find interesting. So how are they receiving questions? Can we arm them basically with answers that are appropriate for the question that's being asked, while also making sure that they themselves are aware of what's going on, increasing their own digital and web literacy skills. Does that answer your question? Great, thank you.
Great, thank you. So Jeff, will you please share more with us about your perspective and what you're seeing?
Yeah, so I'd like to jump off that question actually as to why libraries are a good delivery mechanism for this type of training, and how we're trying to really address that in the content of the curriculum. So libraries are places where, through library use, patrons are creating data, right? We're learning about their borrowing history, the amount of information you have to provide to sign up for how many people have a library card, actually, from a New York library? Great. Okay, so you have to give a lot of information to sign up for a library card, right? We need a home address. We might need a piece of mail if you don't have a government-issued ID with a New York address on it. Through your library use, the types of databases you might use, programs you register for, times you sign up to use a publicly accessible computer, your borrowing history, all that sort of stuff. We're producing a lot of data in a library setting. So libraries are stewards of that data, right? We're also dealing with technology education and really being viewed by the public as a place where you can go to get these questions answered, right? So we're trying to leverage both of those through the curriculum to start to speak to these issues and build capacity with our users. We have a real institutional commitment to this, I think. Libraries have been talking about patron privacy going back to 1939 with the Code of Ethics for Librarians, which starts to introduce language about the privacy of patron records and any sort of personally identifiable information that's gathered through an interaction with a patron. And that's really codified again in 2002 in an interpretation of the American Library Association's Library Bill of Rights. So there's a lot of institutional involvement in this and institutional commitment to this. The American Library Association runs a privacy week every year, Choose Privacy Week, in the first week of May. And that's been going on for 8 years, I think, since 2010, where the ALA Washington office is creating a lot of, content for public libraries and academic libraries to roll out with their customers, talking about privacy issues and data security issues. So institutional involvement is number one. Another big reason we want to get into this is we have a legal commitment to. 48 states have a law on the books that says that patron records are confidential and are the only thing that can make them not confidential is a court subpoena, right? Remember the Patriot Act? I assume, yes, we do. So maybe when the Patriot Act came out, you started to hear about library canaries. I think there was actually a Supreme Court case about it for a Connecticut library. People would be posting signs in their libraries that said, this library has not received a subpoena from the federal government or from a local law enforcement agency for your local records, right, for your borrowing records. When the sign goes down, they've received a subpoena, right? So there's a legal commitment there as well. And in terms of our commitment to technology education and digital inclusion, we're really doing a lot of work with community technology classes. In Queens, which I can speak about, we had 6,000 classes for customers around digital literacy issues last fiscal year. We served about 50,000 users in those classes. So there's a high demand, and those are basic to advanced classes, all of which I think have a lot of opportunity to bring data literacy, privacy, security into those discussions. When you first sign up for an email account, you should be thinking about privacy and security, right? It's not something that only civic tech innovators need to be incorporated into their daily practice.
Would you say that the standards enacted in public libraries, at least in New York City at this time, reflect a higher standard of engagement, or not engagement, of intention to preserve and protect privacy of patrons than maybe other public systems?
Than other public libraries or other public agencies?
Other public agencies.
That's a great question. I think that, and maybe you want to jump in here too, Davis, I think there's that institutional commitment. So people that went to library school are on board for patron privacy, right? How that works operationally maybe doesn't always come through. So our manager of organizational assessment is in the audience, waving. That's Jamie Ano. She's convened a working group at Queens where we've brought in a data record consultant, right, to look at our data retention policies with customer data and with employee data as well. So that individual is talking to every single department in Queens Library that works with patron data or works with any sort of data to come up with some policy recommendations for us. Because right now we don't have a customer data policy. And our privacy policy is from 2003, right? So we can say that we're committed as a library to privacy issues, and maybe we are more committed, I guess, from a philosophical perspective, right? But part of what this training is doing is starting a conversation about how that actually can get turned into policy commitments and commitments of practice.
I think it's an interesting question. When we're looking at receiving funding from the city, it's interesting to ponder what it means for us to be arming our librarians with this information, especially when considering that the city also manages a police force. And you might have heard the discussion on algorithmic innovation, which is a portmanteau that I haven't mastered yet, but I will because it's a good one. And they are definitely invested in data and collecting information about what's going on in the city, and maybe even misrepresenting how that data, when you look at the black box issue, there's I think a lot of bias that goes into the data that gets collected. I think that over policing certain districts has an implication for these algorithms. And I think that you don't see that quite as much in libraries. I know you don't, because we do learn semester 1, library privacy is important. You know, in my class, we had someone from the Connecticut 4 who you mentioned Connecticut before. There were 4 librarians who stood up to the FBI when they came and asked for patron records related to the Patriot Act. They said no. It went all the way to like the Connecticut court. So we have that backdrop, that like ethics that like came up in 1939 and still persist, where I think other agencies maybe even require some data collection, but you know, you have to start to question like why and how is this data viewed and who is collecting it and what are the balances, the checks and balances for this data and information that we're getting on people. So I think it's a big question for everyone. I think we may be, given that we've been thinking about it for 70 plus years, you know, we might have a little bit of a head start on this.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, we're also dealing with changes with our vendor space. So, and this is like a whole nother piece that I think this curriculum is really trying to speak to. So one of the tools that will come out of this is a vendor questionnaire to help with contract negotiations. So somebody was searching a catalog, right? Wasn't you? Okay, great. You were interacting with that digital side of the library. That catalog is from a third-party vendor, right? And that there's a huge amount of patron data in there, right? That then is being, what we can do as a library is say, oh, you can read BiblioCommons privacy policy, right? But there's a chance during contract negotiations to hold vendors accountable to a higher standard that the library is setting, or that the field of libraries is setting. That the vendor sector really is trying to sell data-driven solutions right now, and there's a conflict there with what our professional values and ethics and standards are. Maybe you can't get Amazon-style recommendations from your library because of those privacy commitments, or maybe you need to opt into those. So that's another kind of piece to consider here.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah, that's a huge piece of it. Is we are, now that we're in the age of databases, we're definitely also starting to see leaks, I think, in that direction, where vendors are collecting information about patrons or customers or users, and I think that you're absolutely right that the contract negotiation phase absolutely must address this situation.
And that might be actually something that comes out of the privacy curriculum and training that you're doing, which could be a set of recommendations that set a high bar, right? Mm-hmm. Based on practices and demonstration for other agencies for contract negotiations. So I'm wondering from both of you at this point, if you could see the next phase of this work be enact or realize what you hope it will. What does it look like? What does it mean for patrons, users, customers? What does it mean for people? And what does it mean for your libraries and your work? And potentially, what does it mean for cities as they want to invest or have an intervention that's productive and positive?
That's a good question, too. If I envision in my mind's eye success from this phase, it will be that there will be more patron-facing, customer-facing activities where people are coming to the library, seeing them as a resource, making sure that libraries are there for these purposes. I think that privacy, from what I've seen, I train on privacy situations all the time. Like I just gave a training on Tuesday this week on privacy and security. And there seems to me to be a very passionate few who will turn up to any occasion possible to speak about privacy, exchange notes. They have often more information about certain areas than I do as a trainer. And it's like, seems like there's a very good conversation that's happening between a relatively few people. So my ultimate dream would be that we could build more people into these communities, more people are coming to these conversations, more people are realizing that their information is implicated. All of our information here right now, our cell phones are saying that we're in this room together. Someone could come and see this about us, that we are here now, networked together. And that's our digital footprints are really, they're growing all the time, and we need to know this, and we need to know how this could be turned against us. We need to know how to protect ourselves right now. So what I'd love to see is a groundswell of more people being concerned, raising our voices, pushing the federal government on this. I think that they're way behind. Obama had like a privacy bill of rights that didn't go anywhere, and they have yet to talk about it again. So what can we do as a populace to push these issues and say, no, I don't want every waking thought that I have typed into Google to be on the record somewhere tied to my account, knowing all these like macabre details about myself. There doesn't need to be this in order to have deliver good services, in my opinion.
I observed a training at one of our branches in Queens recently. It was maybe the second or third class in a internet basics course. And they were looking at Google Street View. So the trainer had people type in their address, their home address, and there's, a camera had driven by their house and taken a photo. If you want to think of the fastest way to just suck the energy out of the room for people that are taking the first steps towards adopting emerging technologies, that's a really scary thing to say, hey, there's a photo of your house on the internet that anyone can go look at. Reason Magazine in 2004 did a similar thing where they took satellite photos of subscribers' houses from some database and matched it up so that when that subscriber got their magazine in the mail that month, it had a satellite image of their house. And if you don't know Reason, it's kind of like a techno-libertarian sort of magazine. So imagine the response from their readership, right? But I think it's kind of mappable to someone who's just taking their first footsteps into technology, right? So when we talk about privacy and security and understanding that expanding digital footprint and giving people the toolkits to dial that back as much as they can, or at least understand the kind of transactional nature of usability with free technology, free 15 gigabytes of storage on Drive compared to whatever Google is doing with all of that 15 gigabytes of data that you're putting in there, right? And if we can bring that into our basic courses for folks throughout the library system, I think that can go a long way towards building these privacy advocates and starting a broader conversation that's not just happening in boardrooms or not just happening in incubator spaces and privileged spaces, but happening among a broader pool of folks using these tools and technologies.
Did you want to add anything to this?
I did, but I felt like I did want to be a microphone hog. I did want to say that it is really important that we're aware of the trade-offs that we're making. That Google may be convenient, Google Drive might be very powerful, but we have DuckDuckGo. They might not be as fast, as speedy, and there are definitely personal decisions to be made. At the training I did on Tuesday, for example, I don't know if I changed any hearts and minds toward more private solutions, but we did talk about what are you giving up? Is that transaction okay with you? Are you all right with what you're exchanging in response and in relation to what you're getting? And you might be totally fine with Google and like location tracking being on for every app. That's a decision that you can make. And I think that much as we talk about climate change in the way that a lot of small steps will protect us, not one grandiose action, the same exists here, where you can take tiny little steps toward your own digital safety here. That might not be one big groundswell push, but might be like lots of little interventions that you can make. We need to know what those interventions are. We need to know how to apply them. We need to know how to keep up with all that stuff.
So I have one more question, and then I think we should just open it up. When you think about the number of branches where there's one librarian who will be trained, and the project comes to completion, what happens next? How is the work of frontline librarians supported to gain traction where they are? Because it's a really amazing thing that the city would say, let's train everyone in every branch to cover, right? Our commitment to people who need information and support and services. What happens when that person goes? How is the work institutionalized, if possible?
Do you want to speak about the online component and how that could be used for staff development?
Yeah. So one of the big changes between the IMLS supported project I talked about earlier and this one now is that we do need to address that point, that even within the systems, librarians are moving around all the time. New librarians come in, librarians leave for other systems and other places. And so we wanted to build something more lasting. And so that means two things. One means that we're looking as much as we can toward evergreen content. That's really tough, but we've reiterated to our instruction design team that we need to get to the principles more than to like the tools, at least in the online component. And then it is online so that it exists as a tool in the toolkit of the departments who are training their new hires. So we're working with a very elite, I think, group of advisory council members, two of which are here with me. And so we have a great group of people who are really intelligent about this and who are positioned well within their systems to be able to say, hey, this exists, let's keep using it. And so it's not just, one and done, it lives on. And hopefully we can do such a good job that the city loves us so much that they decide to renew a contract. And we sort of take a look again and see what worked, what didn't work. We'll definitely be doing outcome measurement and assessment for sure to see how librarian staff took this in and whether they used it and how they used it, what they would like to see differently, so that we can have a good database, a good data set of things that could be iterated upon for the hopeful next time.
We did, so Davis mentioned the Data Privacy Project, which is the first sort of iteration of this that came out of Brooklyn Public Library. We were written into the tail end of that grant at Queens Library, and we trained about 150 staff people. And the response to that was really interesting to read, the evaluations that people took after this 6-hour training. Some people said, why is the library even getting involved with this? If people want the information that they are searching on library computers to be private, then they shouldn't search things that are, they're worried about people finding out about. And other people were so happy that we had started a training and staff development conversation around these issues, because they were hearing it so much from their customers or from their users or from their patrons that to create an opportunity to really weave that into either onboarding of new staff or ongoing professional development for existing staff was seen as a real key piece. I think that's one of the key pieces to sustainability, whether it's an online module or something that at the 3 library systems we're building into the onboarding and into, we all have regular talent development programs where we're doing monthly trainings. So this is something that could easily get added into the calendar, which is what our plan is at Queens. And we'll take it from there.
Thank you. So I think we've got about 20 minutes left, 25 minutes. And at this point, it would be great to get your thoughts, clarifying questions, suggestions, and just to say, if you also have comments or opinions about the role of libraries in providing digital security and privacy for folks, I think that will help take us to another level, which is what are the assumptions, right? And what are going to be the needs going forward? So go ahead.
Hi, my question is about the privacy of patron borrowing records. After the Patriot Act was passed, there was a lot of discussion about once you returned your book, something like 60 days later, the record was permanently purged from the database, so there's no privacy issue. It was my assumption that many library systems had adopted that policy. So what is the state of art at New York City right now?
Great question. So it is up to the library system. One thing that, I'm not sure if this is true of libraries throughout New York City, but at Queens you can opt in to have a shared history, right? So that you as the end user would be able to go in and see your entire borrowing history for,
well, it's only up for 6 months.
6 months.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you have to opt into that. Otherwise, as soon as you check your as soon as you check in your item, it's completely erased. So we don't have that 60-day waiting period. It's just automatic.
Got it right away.
For Queens Library. I can't speak for Brooklyn or New York.
The New York City, the public library, New York Public Library, released a brand new privacy statement on their website at nypl.org/privacy that I'm not sure if you remember, that created a really big splash given that it came in November 2016 or December 2016. People wrongly assumed it was a response to the current election that we had, but in fact it was years in the making. Their privacy policy states they use the data for as long as they need to, I think, to cover the myriad vendor contracts that they have. So they're not even really that explicit either, but I know that they, as soon as they can, they dump their database records about who's borrowed what.
One thing that kind of remains to be seen is how the new European Union data protection regulations will affect U.S. libraries because of the vendor relationships, right? So any vendor that's operating in the EU will have to abide by GLDR. And what that might mean is that they'll make blanket changes, like I think Google and Facebook. GDPR, thank you so much. GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, right? Great. What that will mean, what Google and Facebook did a blanket change to their US users as well, right? To abide by this new change in Europe. So if the different catalog vendors or database vendors make those same changes effective in the US, it might mean that you could pull all of your records from your library. You'd have the right to be forgotten by NYPL, which is kind of interesting to think about what that would look like. But that kind of remains to be seen. But it's a conversation that vendors and librarians are having as we speak.
Hi. I think that digital literacy programs of the kind that you're doing are really important. And I think as even someone like myself who is technologically, I think, sort of very interested, as I get further and further into thinking about my own privacy, it becomes an enormous barrier to entry for me to, like, I don't know how to set up a VPN. Like, I don't want to run my own email server to have email that I'm sure is secure. And that strikes me as something that maybe, a library could provide a lot of guidance and resources for people who don't have the time or the energy to think about these kind of things. And I'm just wondering if and what kind of programming or you're dedicating to things like that.
So VPNs are in this curriculum. It's difficult, and this has been kind of an ongoing discussion with the curriculum committee as we revised the data privacy project stuff, was we don't want to recommend VPNs, specific VPNs, right? But what we can do is introduce the concept of what a VPN does, how you might use it, why you might want to use it, and where you can go for more information that would give you, reviews, right? Customer reviews of different VPNs.
Is it at all in the realm of feasibility that a library would provide a service like a VPN?
Oh, that's great.
So I happen to know that Westchester Library System runs Tor, and so does Metro, where I work. And so, yes, there is some groundswell toward these types of things happening in libraries. As far as more advanced curriculum goes, we have a limited amount of bandwidth with the staff library workers now. So the whole curriculum is 3 hours online, 3 hours offline for those who choose the offline. And so at Metro, we're fortunate to have an event space. And so my goal is, as we spin this up and as library staff is starting to get more understanding of these concepts or enhance their current understanding, that they'll too be motivated to come and learn more. And so Metro will be starting to produce even deeper dives into privacy, including VPN, including Tor. Like, how do you actually set these things up? And we'll hopefully be able to start training the trainers type model so that we'll be able to spin out of the box, like, here's a kit of parts that you can use to go and teach this course at your library. So I'm hoping that that's an outcome that you'll see into the fall and winter of this year.
Okay, thanks a lot. That sounds cool.
Yeah. Jumping off of that as we move to the next question. One outcome that I think is interesting to consider, and I wonder what it really could look like, is if we're dealing with basic, intermediate, and maybe even advanced internet users or computer users, and introducing these privacy concepts and kind of a library frame of reference for privacy, what does it mean for what like the tech sector would look like 5 years from now or 10 years from now if people's first exposure to this stuff was deeply committed to privacy, right? Technology through the lens of privacy. It might mean that some of the big data companies are taking a different approach to user data, right, and monetizing that. Something that I've been thinking about lately.
So I think related to that, I'd like to get your thoughts on, I think for those of us who remember sort of before and after, seeing the picture of your house on Google Maps is shocking. If it's been that way for as long as you can remember, it's not shocking. And so it's one thing to sort of give people the information for how they can use DuckDuckGo or some alternative or protect their information. But for a generation that's coming up with the expectation that all of their information is available, how is that? I mean, it's not, suppose it's beyond your responsibility to sort of indoctrinate them that privacy is a good thing, but how do you maintain those protections for young people who have never known a different world and haven't necessarily thought of what it might mean to have all that information out, when they're 40?
That's so good. Yeah. So I just read an article that kind of corralled all the blaming millennials for something or other. But I will blame millennials here because I think we're seeing, I don't have specific data points to talk about, but researchers that are looking at teenagers and social media are reporting that there's a real thirst for privacy among teens and a real rejection of the oversharing, my life's online, a real fatigue with that, right? So we might be seeing a real blowback in the sociological research right now about privacy and tech companies and data and all of that. I think for folks in my parents' generation or my generation or Gen X, it's kind of a different conversation, right? How do we get people to be concerned again, or bring them back to that moment of the fear, right? But how do we use the fear in a positive way, I guess, and rather than just scaring them? I don't know if you have thoughts.
I totally have thoughts. Yeah. First of all, I'm always, when I'm hear read studies like that, I'm always curious because I hate to view a group of people as a monolith. So I'd love to see the raw data on that. So send me a link and I'll look into it. One thing, speaking very personally here, one thing that has been very striking to me these past 2 weeks is reflecting back on what happened at Parkland and how absolutely inured I myself have become. I was a senior graduating out of high school when Columbine happened, and so I never experienced these active shooter drills. I never had the fear that someone was going to come in with a gun to my high school. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really awed and proud of the people who are speaking up and how just persistent they are and how clear-eyed they are. And I wonder about that for us as well. We're digital natives or whatever, actually I said that backwards. We sort of we live now online. When I was 13, I got AOL for the first time and sat in chat rooms like everyone else and said my name and age a bunch of times, and that's about it. But now that I've lived in this world, I'm just privacy is forsaken. It's over. My partner is we don't have any privacy. Just research your illnesses online. And I'm I want to hold on to that shred of dignity still. And so I'm convinced that I need to convince him, which is my biggest task of all. And so I think that there might be more promise coming up behind us. People might be seeing things differently than I'm even aware. As I've been seeing these past 2 weeks, I might also be inured to what's happening with my digital privacy and safety. We might all be in this room. And so I'm hopeful that people coming up will sort of have lived it a different way through a different lens, and we'll be able to push back on things that just aren't right. We shouldn't have to give our location away in order to receive restaurant recommendations, for example. That doesn't make sense. Maybe people will be more clear-eyed about it when it is just what's the water and can I evaluate what I'm swimming in here?
I just wanted to follow up on what you said, just to comment is, I know among younger people, like, they especially like Snapchat, because like the video or whatever you shared, like, just goes away. I mean, maybe not like from Snapchat, like, I don't know, they like delete it themselves, but like it goes away. And especially like in like other countries where like their government or whatever, their culture is more oppressive. Like I was like over in like Jordan like a year ago, and I was like, I mean, just talking with, I don't know, people who are younger than I am, but they're from like Saudi Arabia and like Tunisia and like, I don't know, like Turkey, like these countries where governments, like especially not friendly, like that. I don't know, that's the kind of thing that they like to use. So just a comment.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have some statistics on that. So 75% of 13 to 17-year-olds are on Snapchat, and it's like under 50% use Facebook. So if you just think about why they might be drawn to Snapchat, right? It's the ephemeral nature, and so maybe it's a reflection of their values towards privacy, right?
Kind of flipping the conversation entirely. In the context of this day where we're talking a lot about making data more open and how we can use data to improve our communities and our lives, what are ways that you think that libraries can respect the privacy of their patrons but still use data, and what data can they use to make their system better and better serve their constituents?
I love this question.
So this is like the million-dollar question in libraries right now. I mentioned kind of that dialogue that's happening with the vendor community. And vendors are really drawn to data-driven products because it's, wow, you could serve your users so much better if you allow yourself to mine that information a little bit. And actually our internal privacy audit that we're doing, or looking at our data retention at Queens, was sparked by some conversations that happened internally about using credit bureau data to better market some of our programming or better connect with our users, right? And some people in the organization felt like that was in conflict with some of our values, right? So we started to look at what we're doing. I don't know if I have a great answer, but I think it's a question that all libraries, public libraries specifically, are giving a lot of thought to right now. And I don't know if we'll see some broader conversations at the national level within the American Library Association or some of the divisions. But
I would say there's more than one way to collect user feedback. We just have to look to like 30 years ago to figure out, what methods were used to collect information. Yeah, there's like surveys and, focus groups and all that kind of stuff that could help fill that gap, I think. The second answer that I have for that is that I would love to see libraries get more involved in citizen science type projects. That we may have talked about it today. I came at like 2, so forgive me if I missed this. The tree count, this tree census that was done. I think that's a beautiful example of bringing New Yorkers together to do something that's related to data, that doesn't give up any privacy, that's like feeding data sets that are useful to the community. So there might be ways that we can employ or engage, I guess would be a better word, the residents of New York toward an end that fills some of these gaps in what we're missing in data sets without using their data specifically. I think that would be a beautiful, holistic way to approach some of the missing data sets that we see around.
right. So we're doing some work with NYC Open Data, or beginning some work with the portal, where we'll do trainings for our patrons and trainings for our staff too, kind of like a train the trainer workshop. All that data exists for New Yorkers because of city and state law, right? That's why it's there, is because the agencies have to turn it over. Our data isn't there because of state law, right? Because we've made a legal commitment reflecting our institutional commitment that those records are confidential. So I think that any decision that we come to around leveraging that data would need to navigate some legal channels as well as some ethical ones.
So I have a question. Going forward, do you see a possibility at any time of just not working with vendors, like of building systems in-house using public funds to create public systems, and then you sidestep some of these problems? Is that feasible in any way?
I'm looking at our. So at Queens, I feel like we have a bad habit of developing things in-house.
I can tell you that one of the discussions, we're not quite there yet, but when we're talking about ebook vendors, especially, one of the questions that I have, so right now when we're talking about our customer privacy, we say, well, it's a third-party vendor, we're just going to direct them to the privacy policy of the vendor. And my question is always, well, eventually we're going to have to make a decision. One of the ways that we can do that is in our contracts. But I am uncomfortable with the ethical question of saying if you don't agree with this vendor's privacy policy, then you don't have access to their items. So I don't have an answer to it, but it's something that I'm definitely thinking about, and it's something that I'm bringing up.
I'm just curious, were you thinking about platform cooperatives?
I mean, that's one potential option, or government putting more money into it. I mean, if they're paying money to give to third parties to build these systems, couldn't that just stay in-house and be used to develop things? It would take more organization and more of a drive from the top, and probably an overarching systemic change, but that seems like a potential path.
Thank you.
And there are models that we can point to. I mean, there's open source ILS out there, like library catalogs and patron management systems, right? There's some open source platforms. There are some platform cooperatives. I think the bigger challenge is things that are a little more product oriented, right? So talking about ebooks, although there are some conversations about leveraging a lot of different resources and pulling people together to create free ebook resources that would be coming directly from the library community. But you're dealing with publishers, right? So it gets into a complicated rights issue. And then with some of the other databases out there, like let's say Ancestry.com has a library product, right? That you can go in and do genealogical research at your local library. It would be tough for a library system to come up with that on their own. Not impossible, but difficult.
This question may be related or not related, I'm not sure, but I feel like a lot of the conversation that I've read about concerning libraries or public library systems in the city are issues with funding, and I'm wondering if your course, Davis, or your new position, Jeff, I think your name, if that's indicative of the library's priority, looking forward, that's where funding might be going.
I'm very glad you brought that up, because I do want to, share with you all that libraries in New York City are 501c3 organizations. They're not city agencies, unlike many, many, many cities in our country. And that presents us with a challenge year after year after year in securing funding for the near future, let alone the distant future. So my immediate thought about building your own systems is funding, you have to sort of have the money. And on top of that, you have to be able to know that there will be money in the future, which is just not the position of our libraries right now, which is a heartbreaker. Fortunately, de Blasio and Jimmy Van Bramer, who's pretty high ranking in the city council, he's a library guy. He came through Queens Library, and he is phenomenal. So we have some tremendous advocates right now. So the libraries do have a little boost in funding this year for operations and a capital plan that will help with the decaying of some of the library facilities, which is sorely needed. But we only need to look back to Bloomberg to see that that wasn't always the case, and that there would be library advocates on the steps of City Hall year after year after year. And I can't even really express to you all the toil that takes on one's soul to not know where your money's coming from, to be passionately in support of the public good, to take basically a lower salary in your life to support your beliefs, and then to have to go begging your representatives for money. It's just not a great situation. So if you all take anything away, I hope that it's like advocating for libraries is well worth it. We are there for all sectors of the population. We're there for people who, no matter what their socioeconomic background, we're there to protect their information, provide access to knowledge, and to be resources in places that other places are completely dropping the ball. Libraries now, I'm on a grandstand. Libraries are now administering Narcan upstate in New York. Librarians are literally saving people's lives, and they do it for not much money. And so that's a real challenge, and I think that that's one thing that, you know, we can do better, I think, supporting libraries as a residents of New York City. Narcan, it's an opioid receptive inhibitor. So it'll basically like push the heroin out of your brain, so addicts will wake up. And by the way, when they do, they're very grumpy because you've destroyed their high. And so not only are you like saving their life, but they're yelling at you because they didn't want you to in the first place. So it gets real tricky. Yeah.
To address the second part of your question about sort of strategic directions, right? I think that libraries nationally, maybe internationally, are trying to really reposition themselves in their community and take a hard look at what their services are and what they're known for among their users. So if you look at in Queens, we just adopted a new mission statement and strategic plan. And our mission statement does not mention books. It actually doesn't even mention collections. It talks about cultivating personal growth and intellectual growth and building strong and resilient communities. So that sounds like something that, it sounds like it could describe a lot of different types of organizations that aren't necessarily warehouses for books, right? And if you think about funding priorities, something like this, like where we're really trying to build capacity among New Yorkers to advocate for their own privacy online, that really fits into that broader mission statement.
Yeah, just saying, like, before I was in New York, I was in DC and was involved with the library system there. And, like, I don't know, they have some really interesting programs that they've developed. It's like, one is the accessibility lab, so they work with the people, especially people who are blind, like deaf, and like for them to learn about like adaptive technologies they can use like to access like the internet and all this stuff. And another thing like we worked on was developing a digital lab space. So it's like they now have like a 3D printer, and I don't know, like they support like, I don't know, if you're trying to start a business, then they have like, I don't know, resources like, I don't know, kind of like a co-working space and things that they were like experimenting with. And so like, yeah, just trying to offer like new things and like in addition to books, like, but especially the accessibility lab was like really, I mean, it's still going on. It's like, it's really like important and useful program like to that community.
So we are just at time, and I wanted to just ask you to share the website for the original data privacy project and any other current curricula that you think might be of interest to folks as a way to follow up. And then I wanted to see if you had any closing things you want folks to, take away.
So the curriculum that we're building off of can be found at dataprivacyproject.org. We, as a curriculum committee, talk a lot about other sources. Mozilla Foundation is about to launch a new set of tools to teach web literacy in aggregate, and there's definitely an activity called Safety First that's all about privacy. Tactical Tech is out of Berlin. They are phenomenal resources for this stuff. Do you have any other suggestions for where people can find this stuff?
The Library Freedom Project is a really cool organization that is looking specifically at these issues within libraries and providing both like mid-level librarians opportunities to lead from the middle of their organization, but also resources for folks higher up as well to adapt policy changes. And they just launched an institute, so they're doing a national training. I think the first cohort is starting in June, and it's maybe 15 or 30 librarians, the Library Freedom Institute, so you can Google that if you want to see what some other similar projects like this are happening in the field. Yeah.
And one other resource is myshadow.org.
That's a good one too.
One other resource is myshadow.org, which is a mix and match curricula out of tactical tech, and is great for folks who don't want to have to figure out the VPN all on their own and make it up as they go. It actually is supportive of that. So one final closing question for you all is, do you feel like you've got a better sense from when you came in what libraries can do to support digital privacy and security? Cool. All right. You did your jobs. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.